Hi, I'm Michael Darby, Global Technical Director at TÜV SÜD, and I'm here in Bavaria and Straubing in Germany with my friend and colleague Thomas Ring.
Hello, my name is Thomas Ring. I'm located here in our radio and EMC lab in Straubing. And together with my colleagues, we help our clients to get global market access for different products.
Yeah, very good. And today we're going to do a short video talking about the topic of radio modules. Now, what exactly does that mean? You don't have to be a module manufacturer to be interested in this video, but maybe you install a radio module into your product to turn your electronic device into a radio-enabled device. This is actually a really common process in our industry where manufacturers, maybe they don't have their own RF design team, and so they'll buy in a Wi-Fi module, Bluetooth module, cellular or GPS to make their product radio enabled and connected. So some different regions around the world have a modular approval process. So for example, in the USA and Canada, there's actually a radio certification process, and you can get a certification on a radio module that when you install the module into the end product doesn't need to get certified because the module already has a certification. And then other regions such as your EU, the Radio Equipment Directive or CE marking, there is no certification and therefore there is no modular approval. But the module might have been tested and CE marked to allow the module to be sold. And then when somebody installs the module, they might choose to accept some of the test results from the module, repeat other tests, but then the end product still needs to be CE marked and authorized to the Radio Equipment Directive. So straight away, the two main markets of USA and Canada and EU, some pretty significant differences. And what about you, Thomas? Markets around the world, do you see a range of differences?
There are definitely differences because there are some countries that do allow the modular approach. So that means host manufacturers can use that, can rely on that in certain ways. But there are different rules in different countries, as we know. For example, Japan, there is not a modular approach, but you can treat a module as a radio device for its testing. And a host manufacturer, of course, when installing it, has to look at things like labeling, the numbers, statements, maybe for the user or whatever. Brazil is another example. It could be used a radio model approval, but you need to check, is it a plug-in module or is it really already placed on the layer of your PCB or whatever? Or Korean, for example, there is also a kind of certification procedure existing for modules, and a host manufacturer can really use that, rely on that. If you don't modify, use the same antennas or whatever. But there is a second EMC registration. You also have to perform testing according to Korean standards. And then you go to the authority and apply for a second number, what you have to put on the label of your device, for example. And yeah, these are a little difference all around the globe.
Yeah, okay. So it's good to know that there's not a standard format around the world. And so you might listen to that and think, wow, this whole concept of installing modules sounds really complicated. Why would anyone do it? Well, there's obviously a lot of benefits to it. So one of the biggest benefits, if you make a medical device or a piece of IT like a printer or maybe a piece of a vehicle, you might not have a whole RF design section in your facility or in your company. You might not know how to make a cellular technology or a Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. And so it might be much easier to just buy that module in, install it. You've got good instructions. So the radio module industry is a good way for all products around the world to have radio connectivity. So in general, a good thing, I think, but there are some real common pitfalls, mistakes that people make. For the regions like the USA and the EU and Canada, I think probably one of the biggest mistakes I see is people thinking, well, the module's been tested and approved, so I can just plug it in and forget about it. Plug and play, as people say. And I think a lot of the time people forget that there's a big difference between testing and authorization. So the module's certification for the USA and Canada might still be valid when it's installed, but you've still got to repeat the testing or some of the testing on the end product. And similarly with the EU, when you install it, you're going to have to repeat some tests. You might choose not to repeat all the tests, but the declaration of conformity to the directive is still the responsibility of the end product. So you could say that the authorization of the module doesn't transfer to the end product in the case of Europe. So those are some of the important mistakes I see people make. And as soon as you install a module into the product, you can change everything. You can change the EMC performance, the radio performance, the safety, RF exposure safety, cybersecurity, very big topic, and of course the sustainability of that product. And would you say those are sort of common mistakes that you see around the world as well?
Yeah, I wouldn't name it common mistakes, but a manufacturer really has to be clear about the national regulations, right? So as I said, there are some countries allowing the modular approach, the modular certification. A host manufacturer can use it, rely on that under certain circumstances, but there are also countries where modular approach is not accepted. So what to do then? Is it okay to just do some partly testing on the end product and put together the test reports of the module and submit it to the authorities, or do you have to do a whole testing for the radio standard, for example? Though these are the little things that manufacturers really need to know, to be aware, because I mean, if you do it really good in the very first beginning or planning, where you want to go or what you want to sell, you can save a lot of money and a lot of time to get to the market, right?
Yeah.
And that's the most important thing in these days.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, of course. And here in Straubing, in this beautiful test lab, I guess historically, you do a lot of EMC testing and a lot of wireless testing. I would say historically, probably different manufacturers, one would go into the EMC world, one would go into the wireless world, but you're probably seeing manufacturers have a bit of both now because they've put a module into their product. So somebody would be doing RF testing, even though they're from an industry, that wouldn't traditionally be considered wireless.
yes, exactly. And this is valid for all kind of industrial products, right? Is it medical? Is it industrial? Is it automotive?
Yeah.
Is it consumer product? Everything is getting smart. So there is a lot of responsibilities manufacturers have to be aware of, not to run into, let me say, problems when they later want to get into the market, if there is a custom control or market surveillance or things like that. And a big point.
Yeah, and I think it's probably a big shock to some of the industries. So, for example, if you're a medical manufacturer or an automotive manufacturer and you've been making electronics, medical equipment, or electronics for a vehicle, for years you might have looked at the FCC rules and said, there's an exemption, or the Canadian standards, and say, I'm not covered by the FCC rules or the Canadian standards because I'm medical or because I'm automotive. And you might have looked at the European EMC directive and said, doesn't apply to me, I'm automotive. And then as soon as you put a radio module into your product, suddenly your product is in scope of the FCC requirements, or is in scope of the Canadian requirements, and your product is in scope of the radio equipment directive. So you've put your product into scope of the FCC rules as a medical or automotive device when it wasn't before. So there might be a whole new language and a whole new type of technology you have to learn as a manufacturer.
Yeah.
So for me, if sometimes people say to me, what's the biggest bit of advice would you give to an installer of radio modules? And apart from the whole, don't think it's just plug and play, I think probably one of the most common bits of advice I would say is, historically, the whole process was quite linear or transactional. Module manufacturer would make the module, and then they would sell it to the installer, and then that relationship would be over then. And then the installer would install a module, do some test checks, we hope, and then they would sell it to the end user, and a very sort of linear transaction. But over the last kind of decade, really, we've seen modules become smaller and smaller and more integrated into the product. And we've seen the regulations becoming even more complex. So in Europe, we have cybersecurity requirements, we have sustainability and tracking of all the components in a product. In the USA, there are some components or parts or modules that are simply not allowed to be authorized depending on the manufacturer or their location. And so it's not so easy to just buy a module and plug it in. You really need to work with the module manufacturer to say, I'm going to need to do a cybersecurity assessment of my product. that involves the module. So there needs to be more of a relationship. So if I was installing a module into a product and I was looking for a module online or as a module manufacturer, rather than just saying, which is the one that's the cheapest or the easiest to buy, I would think, which module manufacturer is going to work with me? They're going to help me through my cyber testing. They're going to help me through my radio performance testing. They're going to help me if I need to change their certification for RF exposure. And they're going to give me all of the sustainability component tracing information. And so I would look for a module manufacturer that I could have a good relationship with, like a circular conversation. Similar things for you, Thomas. Have you had one bit of advice?
Yeah, I mean, if I have one bit of advice, I would really say plan ahead, you know, when you start a new project or whatever. And you really need to be aware or need to be sure at the very first beginning where you want to go or where you want to market it, right?
Yeah.
Because as we say, the module manufacturer, as you said, there are a lot of things to be covered, like cybersecurity, radio testing, or whatever. And when you think about international approvals, a lot of module manufacturers already have approvals in place, not only for the EU market, for FCC, for Canada, for Japan, it could be Brazil, it could be some more countries. And if you really think about that ahead of your project or new development, so it could really save you cost, times, and you need to simply be aware of what to do and how to do it right then later on. Right? That's the key point.
Exactly. And I think you've made a good point. You know, the end goal of a manufacturer isn't just to do a bunch of tests.
Exactly.
The end goal of the manufacturer is to get a good quality product to market as quickly as possible.
Exactly.
And if you know that end goal in mind and work towards that. Cool. Well, thank you very much. So again, I've been Michael Darby, Thomas Ring, both from TÜV SÜD here in sunny Bavaria. Thank you for your time. If you've got any questions about this topic, reach out to myself or Thomas or your local TÜV SÜD office or lab. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.